Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to what I hope will be the first of many youth-focused conversations about issues affecting our world. Although, like Wita said, we wish that we were in a classroom, seminar style with one another to kind of have this dialogue. We have the very good fortune of being able to at least be together virtually and also connecting all of our various communities and partners and stakeholders in the great work that Global Kids does. I want to give a special shout out because I see that Carol Artigiani, who is the founder of Global Kids, is on the call or on our Zoom today. And it is with her great vision that we could be positioned to really help our young people not only be engaged in thinking about world events, but to truly act on the issues and the things that are happening in our world. So we want to give a special shout out and an expression of appreciation to her. I want to just help to set the stage just a bit, and we have just the most amazing panelists that Wita will introduce to you all. But what is happening in our world is today, I would say is astonishing. It is truly an atrocity that we see folks from the Ukraine experiencing this moment. But the reality is that all over the world, people are struggling against tyranny, people are struggling against oppression, and people are leaving and fleeing their country for a better place to be, to live and raise their children, and to really be able to be free citizens of the world. And so we're having this conversation because the spotlight is on Ukraine, but know that in our hearts and in our minds, we're thinking about all of those who are in this struggle. It's not, I think one of the things that has really helped us to sensitize us, or not sensitize us to this, has been the fact that technology is bringing us all closer together, and we can see in real time what is happening. I should share with you that as a young person, I had an opportunity to travel to the former USSR and spent time in the Crimea region of Yalta. But had opportunities to meet young people from the Ukraine, from Afghanistan, from a host of countries at Camp Artek. And who would know that as I approach the age of 50, that those lessons, those people that I meet would actually come to fore in this moment. And now I have an even deeper appreciation and understanding for that experience. Because again, it's drawn me closer to the world and drawn me closer to this work to be able to help others move and fight for a just society and a just community. And so that is why we're here today, to help bring awareness, but our hope is that we'll be able to call everyone to action, to stand up for our brothers and sisters in Ukraine, to stand up for our brothers and sisters across the world, but also to act in our community so that we can actually prevent these things from happening in our world. So I want to turn it over to Wita, and I want to thank her and the great team that has put this conversation together. And we're looking forward to a really robust discussion. So thank you, Wita.
Thank you, Dominique, so much, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. We are absolutely honored to be joined by a very distinguished panel of professionals who can talk about the issue a lot more in depth. But before I go into that, and also just introducing myself, my name is Wita Amir. I'm the managing director at Global Kids, Washington, D.C. I've been at Global Kids for 8 years now, and my background actually is as a refugee myself from Afghanistan. This conversation and the subsequent conversations that we will have with our young people about this particular issue and the issue of refugees and displacement and armed conflict is near and dear to me. And I'm delighted that we're able to bring everyone together to have a conversation, but also acknowledge that while we are saying that this is a youth-centered conversation, and this webinar is really here to open some doors for educators as well as young people to have a conversation about this historical and global affairs discussion. So in the absence of our young people right now, who should really be moderating, and generally in a DC culture, that's what happens. Our young people moderate, our young people ask the questions, but we are represented by young people through some questions that they have submitted already. And maybe we can scroll that up a little bit on the screen just for our panelists to have an idea of what are the areas that young people are really curious to know about what's going on right now. And then I'll go ahead and introduce our panelists, and we can go ahead and get started. So Libby, if you can roll the questions from our young people, that would be great. So as you can see, I mean, these are questions that us adults have, but please, let's all remember that these are exactly the same questions that young people are having. They are smart, they are capable, they are leaders, they are global change makers. So they're very much part of this conversation. So I'll go ahead and start with introducing our panelists, and I'm going to start with Melinda Herring, who's the Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center at the Council on Foreign Relations. Melinda was also the editor of the Atlantic Council popular publication, the Ukraine Alert blog. So she's certainly an expert in the area. Melinda has also written many, many reports about the region and also the subject of democracy, as well as led many programs in the region. Melinda holds a master's in government with a certificate in Russia, Eurasia, and East Europe from Georgetown University. And welcome, Melinda. Thank you so much for making time for us and joining us in this conversation. I will now introduce Elise Labott, who is also on the Advisory Council of Global Kids. She is a columnist at Politico magazine and a leading journalist covering US foreign policy and international issues. Elise is also at Foreign Policy, and previously, Elise was CNN's global affairs correspondent, reporting from more than 80 different countries and traveling the world with 70 secretaries of state.
Seven. If it was 70,
I'm so sorry, seven. Yes, of course, we have not had 70 secretaries of state. My apologies. Thank you, Elise. But nonetheless, you have traveled with 80 dignitaries who are talking about world affairs. You're also the founder of Zevi Media. You need to tell us a little bit more about that, which is a digital media platform that is engaging and informing and inspiring young people to solve today's most pressing global issues, and an adjunct professor at American University of International Service. Elise is, usually you can hear her on the radio, see her on TV, you'll hear her voice at MSNBC, NPR, BBC. She's also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and she has a master's in media studies from New School for social research, and her and a BA in International Relations from University of Wisconsin-Madison. Last but not least, we have Jane Buchanan, who has worked in the human rights research, trainer, and advocacy spaces for over 20 years. Most recently, she was at Human Rights Watch. She has conducted investigations into human rights abuses in more than 20 countries around the world and lived and worked in Russia for 5 years. She's also been a huge advocate with top officials in governments and businesses and business leaders to push for lasting human rights change. And she has a master's in international affairs and economics from Johns Hopkins University Johns Hopkins University School for Advanced International Studies. And she's fluent in Russian. But we would like you to carry this conversation in English, please. Thank you and welcome to you all. I'm going to, we are incredibly lucky to have you and have such amazing experts in this moment with us. I'm going to go ahead and start us with a couple of questions, and maybe we can start with you, Melinda, if you don't mind, just to give us a little bit of an overview of what has been happening in the last almost 2 months, it seems like. And then obviously going back a little bit to set some context for us, and your thoughts about what is it looking like moving forward in the coming weeks. So I'll pass it on to you, Melinda. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you all. Okay, I am going to run through a lot of those questions you had at the top, just so I get that out of the way. So Ukraine is a country of at least 40 million. They haven't done a census in a while. So use 40, 41 as a rule of thumb. 4 million, so 10% of the country has left. 10% of Ukrainians have left and have gone into the European Union as refugees. You asked, how did it start? I'm glad you asked that question. I'm going to go into that in a bit. What's the role of NATO? Good question. Ukraine is not a NATO member. And so I think you guys probably have read a little bit about Article 5. It's one of, if you are a member of NATO and you're attacked, all members of NATO will decide, they have to make a vote on it. They have to decide and they will defend you. In general, they will defend you. So one of the sticky points why we see this conflict going on and on and on is that Ukraine is on its own. It doesn't have NATO protection, unlike Poland, unlike the Baltic states. So that's one of the big sticky issues. I'm glad you asked that. Let's see. I can't read my own handwriting. How long has Ukraine been a country? Ukraine has been a country since 1991. So it is celebrating more than 30 years of independence. Ukraine has its own language. People speak a mix of languages, but it has the Ukrainian language, which is similar to Russian, probably about 30 or 40% overlap. A lot of people do speak Russian. In Kiev, they speak a mix of English and Russian, and they have a special word for it. It's called Syrzhuk, and it's a mix. People speak Crimean Tatar as well. English is pretty widely spoken in elite circles now, and that's a big change. Before I answer the questions I was asked to provide, I'll just say a few things. I'm an American who fell in love with Ukraine. I moved to Ukraine in 2007 as an English language. I took a job on Dave's ESL Cafe because my boyfriend at the time was living in Ukraine and he was a Fulbright scholar and he was having way more fun than I was. I was living in Washington and it was really boring and he was having the time of his life. So I said, I'm coming. I got online and I found a job to teach English to mostly adults in Kiev and moved over and also became a freelance writer and fell in love with the country and have had a relationship with Ukraine ever since. So I'm a Ukraine specialist. Before COVID, I was going there 4 times a year. I'm on the board of several NGOs there. And I also have married into Ukrainian American families. So this is personal for me as well. But my family itself is not Ukrainian. So I was asked to explain what is happening and why did Russia invade? So these are the big questions. So what is happening? So Putin went into Ukraine on the 24th of February. And this had been going on for a while. There had been a buildup. There had been more than 100,000 troops to the north, to the south, and to the east of Ukraine. And these troops had been sitting there and intimidating Ukraine for a while. And Vladimir Putin was sitting there and smiling at us. And we had these long debates in Washington. What is he doing? Is he trying to get a deal at the negotiating table? Is he actually going to go in? I was one of the analysts who said he's going to go in this time. And one of the reasons I said that is because Putin has an obsession with Ukraine and he's unwilling to let Ukraine go. So one of the questions you asked was, what's the relationship between Russia and Ukraine? That is a really good question. And I can't summarize it in 5 minutes. So complex, there's familial ties, there's linguistic ties, there's religious ties. In general, if you want a note of just a summary, Russia treats Ukraine like a little brother. It has a condescending attitude. And I think the best summary is, if Russia lets Ukraine go, it fails to be an empire. So that's a lot of the mentality in why Russia will not allow Ukraine to join the West. That's what this fight is really about. So what's happening? So on the 24th, he came in and he had 4 goals. Vladimir Putin wants to destroy the Westernizing project in Kiev. So since 2014, Ukraine has been changing and it hasn't been perfect. It's been up and down, but they have embraced a Western orientation, both in their constitution and then in a ton of reforms. The progress has been up and down, but there's been real progress. He wants to destroy the unity of NATO and he's failed there too. So there's two countries are probably going to join NATO as a result of this war. He wants to humiliate the West. He would love that more than anything. He hasn't succeeded there either. And he wants to rewrite the rules of the European security architecture. And it's horrible jargon for rewriting the way that Europe has been governed since the end of World War II, the institutions that we put in place after World War II to keep the peace. And he hasn't succeeded there either. So on 4 accounts, Putin has failed. The Ukrainians have done much better than expected. So one thing that's interesting, a month into this, looking back, what did we get wrong? So we thought that the Russian military was 10 feet tall. They're not 10 feet tall. And we thought the Ukrainians were 2 feet tall. They're not 2 feet tall. The Ukrainians have been fighting for 8 years. This is not Putin's first rodeo in Ukraine. So we got to go back a little bit. Go back to 2014. I mentioned 2014. If you remember a couple of years, remember 1991, independence, 2014, Euromaidan revolution. So again, I have to summarize really quickly, but there was a big conflict. People my age, people in their 30s and 40s said, we want to be, actually students came out and said, we want to be part of the European Union. And there was an agreement over the association agreement. It's a really boring trade agreement with the European Union. Yanukovych, the president at the time, said that he was going to sign the association agreement with the EU. And, you know, that's not something sexy that I would have ever thought would have brought people out. Students poured in, and then he backtracked and said he was going to sign a trade association agreement with Russia. Students protested. They came out in Kiev on Krishchatek, it's the main square, and there was violence. And Ukrainians are willing to put up with a lot of things, but not violence towards their children. So that's what sparked this big revolution in 2013 and 2014. And just to cut to the chase, Yanukovych fled to Moscow and Ukraine embarked on a pro-Western trajectory. When you have time, look into Euromaidan revolution. It's fascinating, but that's what set this all off. And Ukraine has been moving slowly but surely and embracing a Western identity. And it drives Vladimir Putin crazy. He doesn't want Ukraine to succeed. So why is he doing this? A couple of reasons. He doesn't want Ukraine to become a vibrant Slavic democracy. If Ukraine becomes a vibrant Slavic democracy, he can't backtrack anymore. He can't backslide. He has no excuse. Because Ukraine and Russia are so similar, he can't say, oh, it's impossible for Slavs like us to embrace democracy. The argument is over if Ukraine succeeds. They also have those historical reasons that I talked about. There's a lot more to it than that, but I don't have a lot of time. There's also the psychological. This is, to me, the most interesting. Putin is an old man. He's an aging autocrat. He's been in charge for 22 years. He bet the house on Ukraine, right? So he's been in power. He's been relatively successful. We can't figure out how to get rid of him. The Russian people can't figure out how to get rid of him. He does have real achievements. He rebuilt Russia. It's a real country. He brought it from a very low point. They had macroeconomic stabilization before this stupid war. We thought they rebuilt the army, not so well. But he had real achievements. He bet the house on this invasion, and it isn't going very well. But he's thinking about his legacy. And when he talks about legacy, he talks about Stalin. He talks about Ivan the Great. If you want to go down in the Russian history books as a great leader, you take land. So this was his opportunity. He also spotted weakness everywhere. So we know that he's been wanting to go after Ukraine and destroy Ukraine for a long time, but it wasn't, the timing was not right. So what happened last year? Vladimir Putin is wily, and he looked at the map and said, goody, goody. Biden is old and weak. His numbers are sliding. He screwed up in Afghanistan big time. He said, opportunity. Merkel is gone. Opportunity. he saw Zelensky's numbers, the president of Ukraine's numbers sliding, opportunity. And then he saw how weak the Europeans are. He can do whatever he wants. The Europeans don't have the conventional land forces to stop him. And he said, delicious. It's time. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but there's enormous opportunities, and time wasn't on his side. So Ukraine had been growing more and more toward the West. 62% of Ukrainians want to join NATO. Those are really high numbers. And he knew that if he delayed, that number would continue to increase. So he decided to go into Ukraine and do it on his own time. So I think that's a good summary, and I'm happy to take any questions when the time is right. Thank you.
Melinda, thank you so much for, putting in decades of history and what's going on now, and probably one of the most historical armed conflicts in our modern time in 5 minutes, and very eloquently, and I got it. So that was really, really helpful. Thank you so much. There will definitely be some questions to follow up. So I'm going to pass the mic over to you, Elise, to give us a little bit more maybe about what is the reaction around the globe on what is happening, what are the reactions in terms of the media coverage. What are you seeing as a international correspondent and a foreign affairs journalist and a person who really has a lot of experience in covering world conflicts? So I'll pass on the mic to you.
Sure, Wida, thank you. And to go after Melinda after that amazing kind of encapsulation of what got us here today, I think that really puts us off on a great jumping point to look at the reaction. So, I mean, one of the things that I've kind of seen, and I think Melinda said it well, that when Vladimir Putin, I mean, let's just remember that, Russia has been declining in power over the last 20 years, but certainly over the last decade. And since Vladimir Putin has come in, he's really tried to create this idea of great Russia again, not really to reconstruct the Soviet Union, but to make Russia as a great power. And you saw him trying to, and he did annex the Crimea in Ukraine. He went after Georgia. He's going into other areas of the Middle East. You saw, if you followed the conflict in Syria, you saw that he sent forces there because he wants to have influence in the Middle East. So Vladimir Putin has really been trying to project Russia's great power around the world. And part of that is to stop NATO expansion and to assert Russia as having a really good hold on Eastern Europe. Now we could discuss, and we can discuss later about whether at the end of the Soviet Union, the US kind of handled, at the fall break of the Soviet Union, how the US handled that and whether there could have been a better way to integrate Russia into Europe. And so it didn't, I mean, a lot of times Russia says, oh, we have security concerns and that's why we're doing this. They don't really have security concerns, but certainly they feel insecure about their role in Europe. And so I think a lot of that is kind of projecting. He wants to be the big man on campus, as we say, in Eastern Europe and around the world. And so that's really what got us here today. Now, Melinda spoke about, about the history of it. It's true. For the last 8 years, he's been having designs on another part of Ukraine. And I got to admit, I called it wrong. I didn't think he'd go in and launch this massive full-scale military invasion. When he took the Crimea, which is in the southeastern part of the country, I thought he was just going to take another part of the southeast called the Donbas region. And I thought then he would have another little piece. And then in a few years, he'd take another little piece because, although in 2014, there was a great outcry and sanctions about him seizing and annexing the Crimea, since then, there hasn't been a whole lot of international action to try and get it back. So he thought, oh, I could take another little piece and, in a couple of years, there might be some more sanctions, but people will forget it. And then we'll move on. And so I think what happened was No, he's, as Melinda said, he wants to go in and take the whole country. And why does he want to do that? Because he wants to delegitimize the government there. He wants to overthrow the government there and put in his own puppet, you know, what we talk about when we say a puppet government. He's the one dangling the strings of the government. And so he wants to put a puppet government there. And so then he's, you know, he doesn't have to worry that they'll join NATO. He doesn't have to worry that they'll join the EU. And so then again, he can still have that hold on Eastern Europe. But no, he went in full Monty, full scale. And I think that's what caused this major international reaction. I got to say, although the US and other countries in Europe and around the world warned him, don't you know, he was amassing 200,000 troops on the border with Ukraine, and everyone said, don't do that, don't do that. He did it. So I don't know that there was enough done to prevent him from going in, you know, sanctions beforehand, but certainly there was a swift, massive international reaction to what we're seeing in Ukraine. And I think because what we're seeing, and I think there was an interesting question about why there's a world reaction to what's going on in Ukraine and not other conflicts, particularly when it comes to refugees. But no one's really seen a conflict in Europe. I mean, when we think of the Middle East, I don't think about this. Nobody in this room, in this Zoom room, thinks about it because we're globally minded. But a lot of people think of, you know, when they think of Africa or they think of the Middle East, that's far away. We can't relate to that. But when we see a conflict in Europe, right, where a lot of our ancestors came from, or, you know, we know people that travel there, there's like this huge international reaction. Plus the fact that he launched 200,000 troops into the country, there was a massive international reaction. Huge sanctions along the lines we've never seen really against any country, basically shutting down everything, you know, banking, oil, and really what Putin really wants is this international legitimacy. Every country in the world, pretty much, maybe there are a dozen out of 185 countries that aren't really siding on to this alienation. But Putin has really alienated himself, and that makes him even madder. So the international reaction, international companies, everybody's pulling out of Europe. Big tech companies, like we're all on Facebook and Twitter and Google and Instagram and all that stuff, TikTok, all left Russia. So now Russia is completely isolated. And we'll talk more, I'm sure, about the fact that Russians don't really know what's going on because Putin cracked down on information, and he doesn't call this a war. He calls this a special military operation to get rid of what he calls Nazis in Ukraine, which is ridiculous, right? A lot of Ukrainians are Jewish. It's not a country of Nazis, but that's the myth or the lie he's telling his people in order to launch this attack. And so as a reporter, to see all of these people, as Melinda said, 10% of the population leaving the country, it's devastating. We've also seen a bombing and violence along the lines we haven't seen in a long time. Again, we did see a lot of this in Syria, but now there's heightened attention to what's going on there, particularly in the city of Mariupol. And the international community is saying that war crimes are committed. And we could talk about what a war crime is, but just the level of violence, the level of brutality, the displacement of people in the country is really, as Wida said, the biggest conflict that we've seen in our lifetime. And it's in Europe's backyard. And so the question is, how do we end it? How do we go from here? Russia is not doing very well. You know, as Melinda said, the Ukrainians are really fighting back. And the patriotism and how every citizen has a role. You know, a lot of citizens are taking up arms and joining an army. Other citizens are making, helping feed the army, or they're helping resources, or they're helping people as they're leaving the country. Every Ukrainian, and I think it's really important for us to see this, the love of their country and their love of the people in their country and the patriotism is making the morale and the resistance of the Ukrainian people so strong. Plus the army is doing very well. Plus they have a technology apparatus that we can talk about also. Everybody's fighting back, and they're fighting back hard, and they're doing pretty well. I mean, look, there's a lot of damage, death, and destruction, but they're still standing, and they're saying, you're not going to take our country. You see grandmas going up to the soldiers and saying, you get out of my country. Who do you think you are? The bravery is really, the Russians didn't expect it. And so we don't know how it's going to end, but it's not, I think, going to end with what Putin hoped, which is what we started talking about at the beginning, which is taking over Ukraine and making it a Russian state. That's not going to happen because the Ukrainians love their country and they won't let it happen. And they're getting a lot of international support, as Melinda said, and I'm going to end my comments here. They're asking for a lot of things to defend themselves. No, NATO doesn't want to piss off, as we say, the Russians and start a war with Russia. So they're being very kind of limited as to what they'll do inside the country. But they're giving the Ukrainians a lot of weapons, but they're only giving them certain weapons because, again, they don't want to anger the Russians and trigger the Russians to fight inside NATO countries on the border. So President Zelensky, the president, is saying, look, I appreciate everything you're doing, but I need a lot more because we're defending ourselves. We're also defending Europe. We're like the last line of defense against Europe, and we need a lot more. Most of this is being done through an air campaign, and they want weapons to shoot down Russian planes. So that's where we are right now. There are some peace talks going on. We'll see how that goes. But the weaker that the Russians get in this war, the stronger the Ukrainians become.
Thank you so much, Elise, for that very in-depth, worlds and international sort of reactions, and the fact that Ukraine is surprising everyone by how strong and dedicated they are to defend their country, with obviously a lot of help, as you said, from the NATO countries, from the US, which again, I think one of the questions is that, in other conflicts in the world, and most recently, for example, Afghanistan, the outpouring of support, particularly on the, armed conflict support, has not been like this. So we can talk about that in a little bit of a different question. So I'll go ahead and pass it on to you, Jane. If you can talk to us a little bit about the humanitarian crisis that this conflict has created. Obviously, the refugee crisis, as we mentioned earlier, and you've heard from other panelists, have been going on for decades around the world. This is another reminder of what a travesty and what a international human rights crisis we're facing. So Jane, over to you.
Great, thank you so much. So I wanted to talk about the overall human rights situation in the context of this war. So human rights, I imagine our audience has some sense of that. But just to be clear, what are human rights? They're rights that are guaranteed to every person around the world without discrimination. And it's based on the principle that we a shared value that these reflect, that there is inherent dignity and equality of every person. And when there's a conflict, is governed by a series of laws. These were formulated after the end of World War II to try to prevent some of those just catastrophic tragedies and suffering of civilians during that conflict. So these are known as the Geneva Conventions or international humanitarian law, the laws of war. These are things that people may hear when there's discussion about the conflict. And the idea behind these is that they're striving to impose some limits on the actions of governments to minimize destruction and suffering that's caused by armed conflict. So when we talk about humanitarian law, we're not talking about is it a fair war? Is it just? Is one side good or bad? It's actually really just looking at the conduct of the war. I have my own opinions about the justness and the righteousness of this war, of course, but when we'll just talk about this kind of from a neutral way, right? And how people should be protected during war. So it's the idea is to reduce human suffering caused by hostilities, protecting people who don't participate in hostilities. So these are the civilian population, or people who no longer participate in hostilities. So it would be combatants who are wounded, or those who've fallen into enemy hands. So who've been detained, who are prisoners of war. They also deserve to be treated humanely. So, one of the key aspects of this is outright prohibition of any attacks on civilians. And unfortunately, in the conflict in Ukraine, we've seen all kinds of attacks that impact civilians directly. So these are attacks on apartment buildings, commercial buildings. There have been media reports and photographs of people being targeted as they stood in line to buy bread or other food or access other services. Attacks on people who are trying to flee the conflict, either on foot, in cars or buses. And then now in some of the areas that are where Russia has secured territory and secured control, we see detention of officials like mayors, also journalists who've been reporting on the situation, human rights activists or other types of activists. And in some cases, their whereabouts aren't known, so they're disappeared, which is a major crime. So it's also prohibited under the laws of war to attack infrastructure that's essential for civilian life, as well as cultural and religious sites. So the government shouldn't be attacking those things at all. Again, in Ukraine, we've seen attacks on hospitals, including well-documented attack on a maternity and children's hospital in the city of Mariupol in the south. It's a scene of extreme high conflict, but also pharmacies, medical clinics, also attacks on warehouses, food storage sites, farms, attacks on schools, on preschools, universities, water and electrical facilities have also been targeted, libraries, archives, so those cultural kinds of sites, and some churches have seen damages. And so, what's happening here? We're seeing both targeted attacks, so attacks from weapons that are extremely, the US calls them their smart weapons that can identify a target and go right at them. But much more frequently, much more prominent is the use of weapons that are indiscriminate. So it means these are weapons that are used that do not focus on a particular military target, but have an impact over a wide area, and they cause great suffering. And inevitably, it will impact civilians. So one type of munition or one type of weapon that you probably have heard about is cluster munitions. So this is super popular weapon used by Russia. They've used these in all kinds of conflicts. I've documented this in Chechnya, so an internal conflict within Russia in the 90s. Russia's attack on Georgia in 2008, and a lot of its military operations in Syria. So what is a cluster munition? It's a weapon, and it's fired, and it carries a bunch of little mini weapons, little mini bomblets. And so this weapon is fired, and then it releases these bomblets over a wide area, and they either explode on contact, or they often don't explode. This is not a very sophisticated weapon. So then it exists, indefinitely, potentially as a landmine, that can be triggered by anyone who gets near it or crosses it, including children, and causes, serious injuries and death. Okay, so then, in this context, we see a lot of people who are trapped or who have chosen maybe to remain in some of these cities where these attacks are really, ongoing and intense. They have no food, water, heat, access to medicines, healthcare. They're living in basements or other types of collective shelters. And, and there's just a great deal of suffering there. We've also seen now people who are detained. I want to say something about prisoners of war, because I think this is maybe less well known, that prisoners of war also are entitled to protection. So that means if you're a prisoner and you're detained by your enemy cannot harm you. They cannot cause you violence. They cannot, they need to protect you, provide you shelter, food, water. They also cannot humiliate you. And, one of the things we've seen on the Ukrainian side, unfortunately, is, showing videos and photos of captured Russian soldiers, forcing them to talk. And, that is, if we look at really the basic principle of humanity, that is something that that neither side should ever do. And just very quickly, people who have fled the conflict, yes, 4 million refugees who have crossed, a refugee, someone who crosses an international border to seek safety and shelter in another country. There are also internally displaced people, so people who have left their homes, left the place where they lived and sought shelter and safety in another part of Ukraine. There are estimates of about 2 million, at least internally displaced people. And they also have the rights to protection wherever they end up, whether they're inside Ukraine or they're outside of Ukraine in places like Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Moldova. So the basic rights to shelter, food, water, sanitation, health, mental health services, and special attention to particularly marginalized groups, at-risk groups, so children, women, people with disabilities, older people, all of whom face particular risks when they're fleeing. And then just the last word, because it's been mentioned. I mean, there are also really serious human rights consequences of Putin's decision to invade Ukraine happening in Russia. So this total information blockade, all independent media within Russia has been shut down. Dozens, hundreds of journalists, thousands, if we're counting activists, have fled Russia, have left Russia out of fear for their safety, their physical safety, the risk of prosecution and imprisonment for violating really strict laws now in Russia about what people can and cannot say publicly. They can't even use the word war. It has to be referred to as a special military operation. And so many people just feel that it's impossible to do the professional job they have always done, which is report the truth and report the facts and call things as they are. So there's just a decimation really of independent voices in Russia. I mean, it's been going on for quite some time now with arrests, harassment, and fleeing of opposition activists and other activists. But this feels like a real almost kind of nail in the coffin, at least temporarily, for all of those voices. And one of the major consequences then is that people in Russia don't get the information, they don't get the truth about what's happening. It's hard for people. Some people obviously will be able to access international sources of information, but that's getting harder and harder. And people within Russia whose human rights have been violated, whether it's your right to housing or your right to education or your rights as a person with a disability, there are just fewer and fewer lawyers and organizations who are there to defend those people's rights, internally within Russia. So that will have repercussions, much wider across society, even beyond, kind of journalists, civil society, opposition, government activists who are targeted and who are fleeing.
Jane, thank you so much for that overview. And yes, very critical for us to keep remembering all the layers of implications that an invasion, a war, a crisis, an armed conflict can have on societies. So before we fully open it up to questions, there are a couple of questions that maybe Jane, you can just take a quick minute to respond to, still around the refugees and the crisis and the refugee crisis. So it's sort of combined. Maybe we're hearing that the U.S. will accept 100,000 displaced Ukrainian refugees. Is that something that's happening? benefits, consequences? Is this okay? Are there already Ukrainian refugees in the US? And why are Ukrainian refugees welcomed over other refugees from around the world? So these are kind of a complex questions that maybe can be kind of combined in one. Yeah, I'll pass it on to you.
Sure, I'll dive in, but I know Melinda also responded in the chat. So
Okay, great.
look, every government should be accepting refugees. And, often what we see in these conflicts, or when people fled the war in Syria or other conflicts in the Middle East and Africa, is that they arrive in certain countries. So in this case, they're arriving in Poland or Romania, Moldova, and it's a lot of pressure on those governments to protect those people and provide the services and support that they need. So it can't just be on the sort of bordering countries where people end up first. It can't be only their obligation to protect people. So every government, every country that should be welcoming refugees and facilitating their movement, their safe movement to those countries and ensuring their protection. And I think, so yes, the US should welcome 100,000 and more. And I think this issue is really important. Who is being welcomed and who isn't? And I think we've seen it both in the US and also in Europe over the last many years, again, with conflicts in the Middle East and Africa, millions of refugees arriving into Europe. And what we see now is a little bit of a, kind of disparate treatment. So all the refugees aren't treated equally. And I think we have to raise really serious, concerns and questions about that. So, why weren't those people given so much protection? I mean, in some cases, people who arrived in Europe, again, from previous conflicts, were pushed back into other dangerous situations, or not allowed to travel on to other countries where, it could be easier for them to resettle. So absolutely, every government has a responsibility to do this, and it should be done without discrimination, and it should be done equally. And you may remember, when Trump took office, he actually prohibited. There were hundreds of thousands of people waiting who had already received refugee status, or were waiting to receive refugee status, and come to the U.S. and they were blocked. So there's actually sort of, a debt owed even in the US for many people who should be here and should be receiving protection.
Thank you so much, Jane. And yes, Melinda, thank you for also chiming in on the chat. I'm going to.
Can I say one tiny thing? I actually have to dash to the next thing. I'm going to be far less polite than Jane is. She's right, but this administration has been terrible on refugees. First on Afghanistan, and now on Ukraine, and it's absolutely heartbreaking. They say the right things, but they don't do the right things. And you basically, I'm an advocate, and I am loud, and I push them, and I know Jane does too, to do the right thing. And the Biden administration is about 3 weeks too late. So you have to push and push and push. They said wonderful things. We love refugees. America's a home of the displaced, and then they do nothing. At least is shaking her head. She knows. So they finally said 100,000. It's a very, very small number. I think one important point, though, is that Ukrainians do not want to come here. They do not want to come to Poland. They want to be in Ukraine. This is only a temporary displacement, is how they look at this. I have to go, but I want to leave on a message of hope. There's a lot we can do. This is a really hard crisis, but even as young people, I think I'm still young, I'm 40, we can do a lot. So the first thing you can do is give. And I know that people have limited resources, but the organization that I know and trust is Razom, R-A-Z-O-M. It's a 501c3 in New York, and they're giving to medical supplies. The next thing you can do is organize a fundraiser. So get your friends together, get your family together, your church, your synagogue, whatever. You can also take in refugees if you have the resources to do it. I also believe in the power of prayer. I think it's really important. You look at the situation in Mariupol, and it's hopeless. The Red Cross can't get in, no one can get in. And then also, if you can call Ukrainian churches or Ukrainian organizations in the area and let them know that you have time, you can help package boxes. But thank you for the opportunity to be here. I've got to go, but this is a situation that all of us can do something about. Thank you.
Melinda, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you. there are a few other questions here, and I don't know if, let's see, help. Before I actually read the questions, does anybody want to come on camera and ask a question? Any young people from the schools, from classrooms? We would love to see you and hear you. Well, I'm hoping that folks are going to come on in a moment. In the meantime, in the last few minutes that we have, as Melinda said, I think some thoughts on hope and some actions. And also, oh, Maria is here. Great. So I'll pass it on to you, Maria, in a moment. But Jane and Elise, anything that you want to add in terms of what can be done? What are some of the things that we really need to keep an eye? Specifically, Elise, for you, maybe on media coverage, what should young people look for? What are some resources? And then Jane, again, I think any other messages that you have in terms of human rights issues and refugee issues. And then I'm going to pass it on to Maria.
I think, Melinda said it very well. All of those things are super important. I think also it's really just important to keep ourselves informed about what's going on. There are all kind of media that, all the New York Times, Washington Post, all of those things. I know a lot of you are on social media, and that's a good place to get things, but we don't always know, because a lot of times it has one agenda or it frames it in a certain way. I'll give a little plug for my own media thing, which is for young people to just give fact-based information about what's going on. It's called Zivvy Media, and it's ZIVVY media.com, or you can find us on Instagram, on TikTok, or on Twitter and Facebook at Zivvy, ZIVVY media. And we just put out factual information so you can at least get a sense of what's going on. And then you can make your own decisions about how you feel about it. No one should be telling you what to think. I mean, obviously, everyone knows that the war is terrible. The war is brutal. There is a lot of death. There's a lot of destruction. But then some people, try to give you, how you should think about it. You should form your own views based on what you learn in school and based on what you're picking up from a lot of different types of sources, right? So, I mean, you make your decision about how you feel about it and how you want to act based on as many types of information as you can. The Russian people aren't so lucky because, as we've been saying, Putin is cracking down on all of the media in Russia. So there are some social media channels that are trying to get information into Russia. But, you try to use if you know anybody in Russia, or you're emailing anybody that knows anybody, try and, the more connections we can make with the Russian people, I think are going to be much, much better for them to know what's really going on, because they're being duped by Putin. Even one of the reasons this war is going on so long is because the Russian soldiers are being duped by Putin about why they're even there. So I think the educational part of it is very important, to learn what's going on and to just know the facts, and then you make your own decision about how you feel about it based on what you've learned. And again, Wida was saying, in Afghanistan and Syria and other conflicts, how does it relate? You make the decision about how you feel.
Thank you so much, Elise. I'm actually gonna pass it on. I realize that we're only 2 minutes away to Maria, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Maria Semchuk. She is a college student, and she is used to be at Global Kids when she was in high school. I really would love to hear from you, Maria, to tell us about, what can young people in particular, we heard a lot from our experts on what's happening and what the crisis is, but what now? What can young people do? What are you doing? And it would be super helpful for us to, and for our audience who are young people and educators, what to do. So I'm putting you on the spot, Maria.
Hi, everyone. You did say my name correctly, which is a rare thing. My name is Maria. So I was with Global Kids, I believe, 5 years ago. And I moved from Ukraine actually 11 years ago. So I still have family there. Some of the family has fled to Poland, of course, because they had younger kids. And all of my grandparents are actually still in Ukraine because they were simply too old to endure days of dangerous travels to, a different border. So with my family still being there, you can only imagine how difficult mentally it is when you wake up every single morning and the first thing you're saying is, I need to call my relatives to see if they are doing okay, because you don't know if tomorrow or an hour later, Russians can drop a bomb on a house where my grandparents are sleeping without any protection and without understanding what is happening. I think at one point we had one of those red missile marks all over our town, and that's when it got extremely scary because, it's getting closer. The war is getting closer and closer. Fortunately, my family all is safe for now, but, it is a big issue, like all of you have been saying. And as someone who is very directly tied to Ukraine, but is here, I feel helpless sometimes, right? Like, what can I do? But fortunately, for people like me who are tied to Ukraine but are here, and for people like you who maybe don't have any personal relations to Ukraine, you can still help. And I think what I will mention has been mentioned by a lot of experts here, but I think there's never enough of talking about this and mentioning this. So I believe that as students, there are two main actions that you can take in order to support Ukraine. First is staying informed, as was mentioned before, and sharing credible information with your peers. It's important to understand that we're not only leading war on the ground in Ukraine, we're also leading a cyber war. Correct. We are leading a cyber war, and there is so much misinformation and propaganda, not only in Russia, but also all over the world, right? That is why it is your responsibility to gather this information and share it with your peers and understand it completely, and make sure that others around you understand it as well, and understand the implications that this war has on you, right? It has on you, it has on the whole world. You need to make sure you're spreading this information. You need to make sure you are stopping misinformation and informing those who know less, perhaps, right? And this spread of information is also very important because I recently received a message from an acquaintance who was saying, well, I see there is a decrease in, kind of information related to Ukraine. And that is a problem. We cannot become comfortable with this war. We cannot make this into our routine because it's still happening. And a lot of what countries are doing depends on the voices of their people. That is why you need to speak up, and you need to ensure that your government knows that this is a pressing issue for you and it should be a pressing issue for them. In addition to that, I think when you are speaking and when you're sharing this information, you need to be very specific about what you're talking. Make sure that you're pointing out that this is a war. This is not a crisis. This is not a conflict. It's way beyond that. Make sure that you are pointing out who's the aggressor. It's Putin. It's Russia. Don't overgeneralize the war. Say it as it is. Be concrete about it. Because by sugarcoating it or being scared by using a word war or naming the aggressor, you are also misinforming others. You need to make sure they know what is happening. And the second action I think that you can take as a student is donating. This was also mentioned. You have heard a lot of it, and you can say, I'm a student. I can't even donate $20. That's normal. You're probably not making money. That's fine. You're spending your time on education. That's good. But even a single dollar can help Ukraine. Did you know that even a single dollar can buy a family in Ukraine 2 loaves of bread or 1.6 gallons of water? Water which is so scarce in Russia-occupied regions that people are dying for dehydration there. Kids, babies are dying from dehydration in 2022. And your single dollar could have saved someone. So never underestimate your donations, never underestimate your knowledge and how much that can help, right? But please, while donating, you have to make sure that you do your research and you donate to organizations that are not fake and organizations that are not supporting Russia and are not benefiting from it, because I have seen a lot of people who have accidentally donated to the Red Cross. And I know there was a whole issue with it and now they're regretting it. I think someone mentioned Razom, and that's the one that I like to donate as well. It also contains a lot of information. I'm sending a link here, and it has all the information on Ukraine. It has a lot of organizations that you can donate to directly to Ukrainian Army or any other, organizations. I think it's a very good link. And finally, I just wanted to conclude and say that Ukraine is fighting for democracy and peace. We did not win this war, and we do not deserve to have our cities bombed, our culture and history threatened, our women raped, and our people, our kids killed by Putin and his Russia. Families and soldiers in Ukraine depend on any sort of help they can have. And that includes you who have voices and resources. And you must use those in the fight for Ukraine, freedom, and democracy. Thank you.
Well,
Very quickly, Maria, I just sent you a chat. Check it out, because I want you to come do an event with us, because I think you perfectly, said exactly what I think, a lot of young Ukrainians are thinking, and we're all praying for Ukrainians, but you just really hit it home for us. So thank you, and please be in touch with me so we can amplify the voices of people like you.
Thank
So
you
Maria,
Thank you.
I think you encapsulated the message of this entire webinar. It is critical for everyone to hear your voice, and I'm hoping that we will be able to include a voice from Ukraine as well. Maybe with one of your efforts that you're doing, having someone from Ukraine join you in our next conversation. But I know that we are 6 minutes over time, but I appreciate everyone staying on and listening to everyone. I thank you, Jane and Elise, for making time to talk to us and bring your absolute expertise into the conversation. And we couldn't have ended the conversation with a message of hope by Maria. Lastly, I will say for all of you folks who have registered and joined, we will follow up with a recording of our webinar, which you can use for your classrooms, for students, for future conversations. We will also send along an educational tool that you can use as educators to have this conversation with folks. So there will be certainly some follow-ups. I don't know if Dominique or Libby or anyone had some last moments, if I have forgotten anything, but other than that, much appreciate everyone's time. And the work ahead is still here for us to engage in. Oh, you're on mute, Dominique.
Okay, I should learn this lesson after 2 years. I want to thank everyone for being on this Zoom today. Jane, Elise, and our other panelists who had to leave. Thank you for sharing your expertise and your wisdom and really your passion. But Maria, as the executive director of Global Kids, I can't think of a better example of the work that we do is to have you represent our young people, but represent your country and the ongoing fight to end this terrible war that we're experiencing, and know that we are with you and we're very proud of you. So thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.